convince people to buy them in the store, they'll force their companies to let them use them. For some reason, BlackBerry and Microsoft thought, well, we sell computers through companies, and so that phones are going to be the same thing. But the truth is, nobody wants their cell phone to be given to them by their employer. They want it to be their cell phone. It's a very personal device, and it took both of these companies way too long to figure that out.
Yeah, that does make sense. It seems like because Microsoft is known as such an enterprise software company between, Microsoft Word and all of that kind of stuff, that they just almost got a little bit spoiled by being able to sell these big batch orders to giant companies, and it was kind of theirs to lose, to be the first one to really just market to people who maybe didn't have a good enough job or a specific enough job that their job came with a phone.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's easy to make fun of them now, but don't forget that strategy made them Microsoft, right? It completely made them one of the biggest companies on the planet, and so you kind of can't blame them for wanting to stick with it. Part of the other problem is they didn't pivot quickly enough to creating a platform that could run the kinds of apps and experiences that regular users actually wanted. Microsoft and BlackBerry were incredibly good at email. There was the BlackBerry Internet Server, the BlackBerry Exchange Server. It was very secure. Microsoft, of course, had Exchange, which worked very, very well for business use. But neither of these things are really good platforms for games, basically, and other browsing internet apps like eventually Instagram and Twitter. And because they didn't have something that could make good apps, consumers would go to the store and they would be like, well, I want something that could actually run Instagram well. And BlackBerry and Microsoft didn't have an option. Apple did, and of course Google did.
And somewhere along in the story, Microsoft goes so far as to buy Nokia, the biggest phone maker, and with wonderful brand equity in the world. And even then, they still couldn't make it happen.
Yeah, that turned out to be a pretty large boondoggle. I think the thinking at Microsoft was, look, Apple's doing really well making its own phones, making its own hardware, selling the whole kit top to bottom, owning the hardware and the software all together. And even though they don't have massive market share, they're doing very well by owning that entire stack, so we should just do the same thing. But by the time they came around to that, they were already on the decline. They already had software that was behind the eight ball when it came to getting app support. And so it would have just taken, some sort of cataclysmic event or some sort of unbelievably amazing phone that blew the iPhone out of the water for that to happen. And that's just a very, very hard thing to do. And, at the same token, this isn't just about competing with the iPhone, it was also competing with Android. And Android was frankly good enough for most people, and it was very hard for Microsoft to make a Nokia phone once they bought them that was, an order or two magnitude better than what you could get on Android or the iPhone. And so why would you go on a platform that, it's basically just as good, but the apps aren't there? And that was just, too big a hill for Microsoft to climb.
And at what point does Microsoft, and while this is all going on, what sort of a say do the carriers have in all this? Microsoft obviously is marketing to the general public. What two's enough, or did the carriers kind of at some point kind of make up their mind and just say, Windows is, maybe we'll have it, but we're not going to really get behind it? Do they weigh in at some point?
They weigh in, the way the carriers weigh in at this stage of the game is basically with shelf space and marketing dollars. And, they're going to give the shelf space and the marketing dollars to the stuff that sells. And so it ends up being kind of a death spiral for a Windows Phone because they can get a little bit of carrier space. There's probably some backroom deals where they pay a carrier to make sure that they get the shelf space that they want. But if it doesn't move, it doesn't move. And, it didn't move, especially in the stores. And so, these carriers, they feel burned after a while. They're going to be less and less likely to make these deals if they're not turning into a real, here comes again, real average revenue per user for stuff that they sell to. And if they're not making money off the phones, they're not likely to give Microsoft another deal next year.
After this commercial break, let's talk about maybe where Microsoft can go from here to try to regain some market share and get people excited again. This is Pop Tech Radio. We'll be right back.
You're hearing one of Mid-America's legendary radio stations. This is Monster Radio, AM 1150.
So far, mostly peaceful tonight in downtown Dallas at a rally to call for the removal of the city's statue of General Robert E. Lee. It was vandalized earlier today, then cleaned up. Some 4,000 people are expected to gather in City Hall Plaza. The base of a Confederate statue in Durham, North Carolina was vandalized today, but not the soldier at the top of the base. Meanwhile, a day well done, they say, in Boston.
I was at Roxbury Community College earlier, and you could just feel a sense of pride being there, that people were going to come out and make a statement about how great we are here in the city of Boston.
Boston Mayor Marty Walsh on a day of demonstrations and counter-demonstrations that saw little trouble. Double sadness in Kissimmee, Florida, as a second police officer shot yesterday has died, the two responding to a report of a suspicious
phones, whether Microsoft makes them or some partner makes them, are going to sell in large numbers in these carrier stores. So instead, rather than try and win on their own selling phones, what Microsoft is doing is it's trying to encroach on what is really the most valuable real estate in all of technology, and that's the home screen of iPhones, because people who own iPhones spend more money on apps, and also on Android phones. And so they've created a suite of software that runs on top of these phones to try and convince people to use their cloud services. So their tagline, which I think is a little bit awkward, is mobile first, cloud first. Now, I don't know how you can have two firsts, but stay with me here for a minute. They figure if they make a bunch of apps that people love on these phones, they'll end up subscribing to Microsoft services like, Office 365, for example. And it's worked out surprisingly well for them. So Outlook, if you haven't tried it, especially on the iPhone, is a very, very good piece of software. And some of that comes because Microsoft has, bought other companies that made good mobile software and just rebranded it as Outlook. So Outlook itself was an old app called Accompli. But that strategy, it might not be, an iPhone-sized business or an Android-sized business, but it's a pretty good business, and it'll keep them at least in the conversation on mobile.
Now, Dieter, did Microsoft have any successes in any territories around the world? It's easy for us, we obviously know the U.S. market, but were there any successes worldwide?
Man, it's tough to say they've had any successes in mobile in the past decade, but they did have a pretty good base of users in Europe. Back in the early 2000s, MSN Messenger was really popular in Europe. That was the default chat app of choice, and I think they were able to parlay that into a pretty good base of use for their classic Windows phones back in the day.
And as we sit here today with essentially a market of two, will there ever be room for a third player?
I think it'll be a while. I think that Google would
Google and iOS handsets are out there now is kind of the market, and that will likely not grow kind of at an exponential rate like it has, or is there still room for more sort of considerable growth in this world?
There's still a bit of room for growth, especially in developing markets like India, rural China, and Africa. Everybody always talks about the next billion,